the topics for tonight are not necessarily as dark, although I think there are going to be some pockets of them that get a little serious. They
Yeah.
both feed into each other, which I think is super nice. And
Hmm.
so I'm definitely pumped to start with this umbrella about digital activism.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna let you
Yeah.
intro it however you want to, because I know this is the topic that you brought
Sure.
up. But it's something that I try to pick apart with my kids at the end of each semester. Now that I do like social
Hmm.
movements at the end, and there's always a component of like, okay, social movements, but now in the age of the internet, like, let's talk about how that's changed. And then now, as you're going to explain with COVID, it's even more complicated. So the floor is yours, my friend.
Yeah. So yeah, I've been meaning to pick your brain about, and we've talked about some of this stuff in other topics, but let me frame this a little bit so that you and folks who are hanging out with us can kind of get a sense of like what I'm thinking. Um, and we've already said this, right? Like this was a summer that was where it was like incredibly challenging to be a black person. And that's putting it like in the most mild and generous terms.
Yeah.
And people took to the streets, and in droves, right, in an enormous way. And white folks showed up in a way that I had never seen before, at least in my lifetime. And in the midst of an enormous pandemic, where science feels compromised, where executive leadership feels compromised, folks went out. Folks took to the streets. And the thing is that like and when I discuss like the ethics and morality behind like rioting and looting, I think folks forget that like it actually takes resources to take to the streets.
Mm-hmm.
Like protest movements are certainly like the sort of this kind of like kinetic active democracy, but risking employment, risking your life to be on the front lines of a protest is like those are steep costs. Those are steep costs, right? Bail money, protective equipment, snacks, paint markers. As the state escalates its violence, the protective measures have to escalate. So you're talking about gas masks, plate carriers, first aid kits. Like it is not cheap to protest, but people fucking showed up. And I was faced with this question because like I've been part of movements that have resulted in like my phone's getting tapped, and that's a conversation for another day. So I know in some ways like the cost of this and how much of a toll organizing like this can take. But in the middle of a pandemic, right? Like folks make different choices. In my case, I'm thinking I've got two kids who I've like if I get arrested, what am I gonna do for them?
Mm-hmm.
What am I gonna do? You know what I'm saying? Like, and so for me, the outside of just like the pandemic and my health, my kids were really like the not a hard stop, but that was like for me priority number one. And then launching We Can't Breathe was my response to the moment, however small that might have been. Now, you and I teach different groups demographically, particularly, and I think they're different um, in age and as a function of that development, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
if there's one thing I've learned about high school teaching is that in college, a freshman is dumb and a senior is dumb but diet dumb. High school, a freshman, a freshman in high school, like that's a baby, and a senior in high school is certainly like they're about to evolve into a dumb freshman in college.
Mm-hmm.
But those two kids are galaxies apart in a way that like your freshman in college and your senior in college are different, but not quite stratospherically divided from each other. So all that to say that for my kids, some of them took to protests overwhelmingly under the comforting wings and protections of their parents. These weren't kids who were like joining black blocs and fighting cops. Um, it's not really like a prep school thing to do. But for them, these are kids for whom social media is totally ubiquitous. Their phones, right? They're silent, right? Their phone is an extension of their person
Mm-hmm.
in so many ways. And so for them, digital activism matters. It's important, and your digital presence says it as much about your proclivities and your likes and dislikes as it does about your politics. Like they place a lot of stock in who put up black squares and who didn't, in a way that you and I, as elder millennials, didn't, right? And we're also sociologists who were like, this is bullshit. Like, we know where
Yep.
this is going. We've seen it before. But that mattered for them. And I had this moment. I was teaching um, about our Black at page. And I've got the right mix of kids, the right mix of, it's been really good. It's been a really, really cool unit. Um, and the challenge is, well, so here's what happened. One of the preliminary assignments was to develop a theme, to look at our Black at page and see like what patterns are you observing, and then screen capping messages, right, and posts, and compiling this like portfolio, and then developing a thematic like definition, an operational definition of that theme. And one student, and then we did like a big discussion board post where people were like, comment, it was awesome. Now one student like in class goes, well, teacher Reese, like, I'm really worried because like my screen, like in my screen caps, like I don't have the little red hearts. Like there were just some posts that I missed, and I'm like, what are you talking about? And I realized that the student was really concerned that because she hadn't liked a post, her classmates were going to read leagues under the sea into the value of that little red heart. So the first question that I want to pose to you as the expert in this field, and it is, what do you see as like the dividing line? And maybe that's the wrong term, but what for you distinguishes like bona fide activism in digital space, and then the virtue signaling that you and I throughout the summer found problematic? Like, what for you are some of the distinguishing features between those two things?
God, there's a lot to say about it. First,
I feel like I gave you a fucking
no,
enormous question, so I apologize.
I think to your earlier point, there is a level of, and I hate to be so Bourdieu about it, but like there's a level of capital you have to be an activist, and to be able
Yeah.
to translate into other forms of capital, right? And you having been trained in the field, for people who aren't well versed in Bourdieu, and you shouldn't be unless you have to read it for whatever reason because it's very complicated and annoying, and French, which Rudy's not here, so I can say all the shit I want about French people. Um, the translation of capital is really important because it allows you that freedom to exercise that right to assemble that we feel is so critical to the American lifestyle, right? We feel entitled to the ability to go take to the streets and scream our opinion from the rooftops. Those rooftops have by and large dissipated. They're not gone. Obviously, we saw a lot of physical mobilization this year, but the rooftops have shifted. They're in a different location. They're now a lot less tangible. But the translation of capital hasn't gone away. And so when I think about in-person protests and how the costs continue to rise, when the costs are at their lowest, objectively speaking, they're still too high for those who are already suffering marginalization. I think about like the Women's March from a few years ago. And it took place during the middle of the day. People were traveling by bus long distances to protest, like during the work week. And so, of course, overwhelmingly the population for that protest, albeit a wonderful protest, was predominantly white women. Why? Because if we look at the social symbolic capital that they have, when we think of feminism, that's the default that we get to when we think of feminism. We always think of white feminism and don't think past that too far for most people. And in addition, the ability to take a day off of work, to know that there will be few, if any, repercussions for doing so, to go state your opinion, right, don't exist for, as far as Patricia Collins and scholars of her, cohort are concerned, for black queer women or any woman who is non-white. That is not a reality that they have.
The precariat in general.
Yeah,
right.
they don't have that luxury. They're the most affected, and yet to take the time to put yourself in harm's way, not just physically, but in all the other ways that you endanger your livelihood to go protest, are infinitely larger for those most marginalized. which I think falls a lot by the wayside when we're thinking about what activism looks like versus that performativity. And so I think that's one of one of the questions of allyship comes into play too, right? Because then white women feel like, well, should we not be out there protesting like for everybody? It's like, no, you should, but there needs to be acknowledgement of the fact that you have access to that privilege more easily than other people do. In the same way that posting things online, right, doesn't come the same to everybody. Some people have to be very cautious about where they post, what they say, whether or not they implicate a person, themselves, right, and what may come back to haunt them in the future.
Yeah.
Because they said some things.
If I might interrupt here real quick, Mothman, like, I think this is also a place where I think, like, we need more nuance around how we talk about looting, right? Like, are there people who on the edges of these movements who are like agents of chaos to be agents of chaos? Yes. Who like light shit on fire to light it on fire? Yeah, absolutely. But you know, I think about Ferguson in particular, right? Like, there was just so much made about the CVS. They lived there. Like, Fergusonians don't own that business.
Yep.
Right? Like that's not a community establishment, right? The jobs that are offered there are few, right? Like, have you ever been to a CVS that is just this like wellspring of meaningful employment? Like, no. And that doesn't keep that local dollar circulating, right? It gets exported to, you know, corporate.
Yep.
It doesn't keep that dollar in Ferguson. And for poor Fergusonians who were the mass constituents of people in Ferguson in 2014, right? Like, busting up a CVS that's not owned by anybody who lives in Ferguson to steal baby formula, right? To take foodstuffs so that you might then keep protesting the next day. Like, I think that's part of the like the ethics of looting that totally gets lost, right? Because we create this binary between like peaceful and violent, and we don't consider the idea that like violence might have like political and social utility. And I think that I'll be frank in saying that teaching at a Quaker institution can make like making that point intelligible to students, and just intelligible, like not asking for agreement, can be really challenging because we operate with that like good, bad, nonviolent, violent binary, and the idea that like we're gonna bust open this institution that's not owned by anybody here to repurpose the goods here so that we might keep insisting upon the systems at play. Like that's totally lost in the sauce when we have these conversations.
Yeah.
But I cut you off. I just wanted to throw that.
I think your point is really legitimate, right? Like, imagine if protests in New York had taken to Uptown, where where we hang out, where we are familiar with all the establishments, right? Let's say, a protest opens at Columbia. Kids are marching down Broadway, right? It would be one thing for them to say, a bunch of agitators are going to go and destroy the coronets, right? Like, we'd be like, absolutely not. Because that is a local staple. That shit doesn't mean anything to anybody that isn't from that neighborhood, that isn't from 110th Street and higher. And even that's pushing it. Like, you have to be like from 135th Street and higher to even give a shit about Coronet's Pizza, right?
Yeah.
Versus going across the street and busting up the Chipotle. This is an entirely different approach, right? And one would say, like, we don't need this bullshit gentrifying establishment in our neighborhood that took real estate from another business. And I honestly, like, I know when that Chipotle went up. Like, I can picture when it was built, but I can't remember what was there before it, which concerns me.
I think it was a Korean grocery store.
Was it? See, and like the Starbucks on Dykeman, I can't remember what it was before it became the Starbucks on Dykeman, which again infuriates me.
Yep.
Because if they busted up Hasa Mofongo across the street, I'd be like, you got to be fucking kidding me.
Right.
But to your point about digital activism, what I think is interesting that I've been thinking about recently is there is a level of looting per se, and I use air quotes in a weird way, that happens with digital activism as well. I was reading an article about the pitfalls of digital blackface, and because a lot of this activist work is done by Black and brown people in the communities that they've been able to carve out and be able to use their platforms, whenever possible. You know, we joke oftentimes when like a meme or a trend gets co-opted, and then like the joke is that it's dead, right? That white people ruined it and we're done with it, and we'll move on to the next big thing. But it's happened as well with, you know, imagery of protest, or not just in you know, issues of race inequality, but I find like the hijacking of hashtags has gone well in some movements and gone terribly in others. And to me, it feels akin to looting.
Bad Boys was hilarious to me.
Yeah, right. Like that was an instance
Say
where.
that one more time, Muffin?
No, so I'm saying that you're right, right? Like the Proud Boys one was great. They did a great job. They hijacked the hashtag and turned it into an entirely different thing than what it was intended for, and that was super effective.
Right.
But it to me, it's like a mediated version, not of looting per se, but there's something about that part of I guess it's not looting, but it's more agitation as an aspect of activism, that like to take over a hashtag that is problematic because it is being used by the oppressors is a form of activism. That's perfectly fine, right? To bury important information about Black Lives Matter protests using the black square and posting nonsense that has nothing to do with information that's trying to be transferred between protesters is a type of like hijacking and agitation, and it feels like theft of a different flavor.
Sure.
Right? Because that thing was created by that group for specific purposes, and then others are like, oh, we're gonna take it when we have no business being part of this in the first place, but we see unrest happening, we see an opportunity, and we're going to do our best to make sure that it fails.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't feel any different to some asshole being like, I'm gonna be the one that shows up from out of state and causes trouble to make this all look worse. Right? Like, it only takes one post with misinformation. Like, recently, what was the post I was just looking at? That I saw that there had to be like a whole fact-checking post about images from a school dance in like the Czech Republic, because it was being spread around as a high school prom that was protesting the COVID restrictions because the couples were dancing back to back with their arms linked, but it was actually a joke at a school in the Czech Republic. And so the image was tied to this false story to help carry the narrative that COVID is ruining the adolescent education experience, yada yada, and a whole bunch of outlets to be like, no, these two things have nothing to do with each other. It's not a real story. Mm-hmm. And that I feel like I've seen that happen time and time again whenever there's been protest online of any flavor. There's just like a couple assholes who are like, what can we do to ruin this thing? How can we misconstrue the information, repurpose this, you know, in a way that's going to negatively impact those who are actually actively participating in activism. And so to get back to your main question, right, like the line between them, I still think has a lot to do with the person, which feels shitty to say, but like the people who are engaged in digital protest, when it's done by someone who is either directly affected by it or who studies it or has some more legitimate affiliation to the issue at hand, not to say that it gives the activism legitimacy, but certainly their approach to how it's done is so much more thoughtful. There's a lot more care and caution to it, right? You're not just like, and even like myself, when I posted the black square, I had to like also put a caption on my own post to be like, by the way, don't use the wrong hashtag, right? I had to like edit my own shit to be like, SEO works this way. Don't use the wrong hashtag. Don't post this for no reason. Don't post it if it doesn't fucking mean anything to you. Don't post it if you don't know where it came from and who started it, right? Like, a few stipulations to say this is not a thing for everybody just because it exists on social media, and you're worried that if you don't post it, somebody's going to be like, hey, you're not down with the struggle?
Yeah.
Right? That performative virtue signaling is a lot of the problem, because everyone feels pressured to be on board with the movement, even if they could give two fucks about what's going on.
So let me ask you that, because I think that piece about pressure is so important, especially for my kids, right? Like, they're well, my upperclassmen are 16 up at the youngest, and then 18, 19 if we got like some reclassed kids who like repeated a grade. So right, I've got 16 to 19 year olds, right? They're learning how to drive. They're thinking critically about their politics. They're applying to colleges and thinking about what they want to do post high school, right? Like they're developing people, and yet like social pressure feels so enormous to them
Mm-hmm.
in a way that like I saw the writing on the wall with Blackout Tuesday, and I was like, I am not participating. I'm not doing this bullshit. Not because I don't. I remember when Blackout Tuesday was a Tumblr thing, and I remember participating in the Blackout Tuesdays on Tumblr. Um, but I can feel one. I'm grown, so I don't place so much stock in what happens on my like social media pages, and I also have receipts, right? Like, can't nobody like come at me talking about like Reese's like anti-racist activism isn't legit. Um, they're like, no, you just can't like you can't step to me and say that.
Mm-hmm.
Folks who've known me for a long time know what I'm about. Which isn't to say that I haven't been ignorant, haven't made mistakes. Right? It's not to say infallibility. It's just I've been involved for a long time,
Yep.
and so I felt totally comfortable like blowing it off. Um, for my own politics. What do you say then to, or what would you say to that 16-year-old kid who's a total neophyte, right? So they're new to the issues, like trying to develop this activist investment, not sure what to do, and feeling that enormous social pressure of like, if I don't post it, if I don't retweet it, then it's gonna get read. Like what would you say to my student who's like, I'm worried that you guys are gonna shit on me
Mm-hmm.
for not having the little red hearts on the right posts.
Um, so I feel like I've become more cynical about it recently. I remember
Sure.
just I think yesterday, I was talking with Lo about something that her mom posted on Facebook that was controversial because it's Facebook and people have opinions, and she
Mm-hmm.
posted something that somebody she knows in real life didn't necessarily agree with. The person happened to be of a religious conservative persuasion, and felt like the post didn't speak to their experience. And so they posted a comment in response to it, and my mother-in-law's like asking Lo, oh, so what, do I respond? Do I not respond? And me, knowing what I know now, my response is, you know, don't read the comments, right? Like that, which is a perspective I think I only have because I'm so heavily invested in this
Right.
arena that I've learned that the worst thing you can do is engage with the behemoth because you're never gonna win.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately for us, everything that we post
Yeah.
and don't post online lives forever.
Right.
The silence is just as palpable as all the shit that people use to fill that void. And
Right.
I feel like it's hard to condition, especially a teenager, to be like, just don't do anything. You don't fully understand, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
to try to convey that there is no need to conform to things you don't actually understand. If you don't understand it, why would you ever want to open yourself up to the possibility of being
Mm-hmm.
grilled for it?
Mm-hmm.
Real facts, Reese, the other Reese, it could get you doxxed. Like, and
Yeah.
that
Right.
is a danger that no one thinks about, really. Like, you can be put on the most dangerous of blasts
Yeah.
for messing up digitally. Right? People
Yeah.
think this is a joke, that it only happens to some folk, that, your information is not that easy to get. It is very easy to get.
Mm-hmm.
Very easy. You cannot
Yeah.
stand on pretense and think that you are hidden behind anything online. You exist on the internet, which
Right.
means that everybody knows everything about you. And you are one click away from having your
Right.
information posted all over Reddit, from possibly being swatted, which is dangerous in of itself. Never mind if you're a person of color, because that can go south
Yeah.
instantly,
Right.
right?
Right.
And so it's hard to convey to kids, but I think my comment, my advice would be just don't, until you know exactly what you're getting yourself into, which you can never know 100%, but you got to know beyond most of a shadow of a doubt, like what is going to happen should I do this, right? Like I think of
Yeah.
all those post chains, right? They started way back on like MySpace, where it was
Oh my
post this
God.
to get 100 followers, post this to get money tomorrow, right? And the internet was new and exciting, and everyone was like, well, I gotta do it, right? Because like my friends did it, and then everybody can see my page, and so if I don't do it, like they're gonna judge me. Um, they're gonna be like, oh, you don't care about money, you don't care about followers, you don't care about being popular, and so you would do it. I can't remember the last time I abided by any of that shit, right?
Yeah.
Some of it is the older fogey in me, some of it is the cynic in me, some of it's the academic in me. Um,
Yeah.
but a lot of it, when it comes to like things that are posted and retweeted, like I'm not out here just retweeting anything and everything. One, I don't have a big reach, so why would I do it? It doesn't matter, right? And
Right.
second, if I can't vouch for it, then or at least know where it's coming from, I have no business engaging with it, right? Like the example I gave you with my student who in their journal talked about, they talked to their parents about the electoral college, and they said that their parent sent them a link to this video about why it's important. And I told you the first thing I did was check the about page of that resource. And what did it say? It said it was a conservative leaning outlet. And I'm like, oh, there you go.
Yeah.
Right? You would
Yeah.
have opened yourself to a can of fucking worms from people who were
Right.
like, oh, so you're a conservative now? You
Right.
believe in this nonsense? Because you didn't check.
Yeah.
And you felt pressured by your own family to be like, you don't agree with us?
Yeah. Yeah. So okay. So that allows me to pivot to the last question I'll ask, and I know I've got a bunch here, but I think you've covered so much already, and I
I mean,
think
we
this will
got
be the
time.
last piece that I put on the table to get some of your thoughts before we move on. Because this piece about, and you brought it up a little bit earlier, this piece about disinformation, to me at least, feels so important and so critical. And it came up at work today. So let me frame a little bit about where I'm coming from and where I'm thinking. The, so the left has totally lost the like disinformation war. Not because the left doesn't have like the propaganda machine that the far right does,
Mm-hmm.
but because the left and the right approach, and I'm thinking about like the polarities, tend to approach like data and information and learning and like bringing people into the fold in really different ways. I've been party to and member of some progressive groups, some liberal groups. This political nomenclature is not important for our purposes here.
Yep.
Left-leaning political organizing group, where when folks, and I leave it ambiguously because the topics vary from race to gender, and so who sits in those rungs changes. But somebody from a superordinate subject position, coming from a place of privilege, will ask a question or sort of own their ignorance and ask for some kind of direction. And oftentimes the response is, it's not my job to educate you. Go Google it. So that's one scenario. Go Google it. The far right, the Proud Boys, the fucking dumpster fire that is the alt-right on 4chan, does the exact, the incels,
Mm-hmm.
who we keep talking about, do the exact opposite.
Yep.
They say, no, we are the arbiters of truth. Come to us and learn what's real. Come to us and learn. I mean, fucking QAnon does this shit.
Yep.
Right? They want acolytes. They want to bring people into the fold. And so you get, and this is a hypothetical scenario, right? You get, and I posed this, in a really fruitful conversation that I had at work. You get this disaffected white kid, maybe in that age bracket that I teach, who is sort of being moved and galvanized by like issues around race, but is totally unsure about what to do. Right? Shows up to some organizing meeting, doesn't know a whole lot, but cares, right? Is trying to put their best foot forward, raises a question, well, I don't really understand why we think of Republicans as racists. An organizer takes umbrage and says, well, you have to go Google that. It's not my job to educate you. Okay, so Jimmy, our disaffected white kid who's trying to make decisions, goes and Googles it. Like, statistically speaking, Jimmy's not going to find, like, progressive analysis of why the Conservative Party can be critiqued for passing racist politics, or why people believe that conservatism is racist in the United States, right? What Jimmy's likely to find are like apologistic papers for coming from places like PragerU, right? Rather than like bonafide news sources or peer-reviewed articles, they're going to find propaganda, and that's what's going to pass as the truth, because all we've told Jimmy is go Google it, which feels like such a shallow thing to say when we're talking about like political organizing. Now, to be clear, right? I value the idea that as an educator, that peers should not be educating other peers, right? That like the learning experience, and I teach a lot about race, the learning experience of my students of color should not be radically different from that of my white students, where I'm positioning my students of color to be like co-educators to their white peers and derailing their legitimate learning by putting them in the position of having to like that I get.
Mm-hmm.
But when I'm involved in like organizing a protest, organizing a response, that's a totally different setting, right? And so my question to you is this: given that framing, right? Like, what are the sort of like, what's the fucking question I'm trying to ask? From your vantage point, as a digital scholar, as a media studies scholar, what feels like an alternative? Because I feel like the telling people to go Google it when Google feels so rife with disinformation, where social media platforms feel riddled with pitfalls. What feels like an ethical, sustainable alternative to that dismissive go Google it? Or am I reading it wrong? Am I totally off base?
No. And this is something that actually gets touched upon in that documentary, The Social Dilemma, where they talk about how much easier it is to go down the rabbit hole of disinformation,
right?
Because the incels and the racists and the sexists and everyone who is problematic from a social inequity standpoint is willing to do the work and say, like, let me host a Socratic seminar for you about why our position makes so much sense.
Why the earth is flat.
I will walk you through right, like, who was it that had to apologize for believing that the earth was flat? Because they went down the YouTube rabbit hole. It was an athlete.
Oh my god, yeah. Oh my, who? It was right, a like, Hooper too.
Went down a deep YouTube rabbit hole and was like, shit. And then had to come out and publicly apologize and be like, I fucked up because I bought into the hysteria. Right? And we talked a little bit last episode about how, I feel like, or maybe this was not, maybe I'm conflating last episode with my class, but like, I've been talking about this a lot. I feel like society right now is just very susceptible to influence. Sure. Like the job influencer wouldn't make any fucking sense when we were kids. It wouldn't work. It wouldn't work. But for some reason, people are so susceptible to poking and prodding and nudging in directions that once you find one talk box that you're okay with listening to, you will just digest anything that they feed you. I remember one of the reasons that you and I wanted to do this is because we felt like there were so many bad hot takes out there that people would just be like, yep, so-and-so said so that's got to be it.
Yeah.
And so my answer to your question is going to be really fucking simple, but we need to be a lot less lazy. We need to shut the fuck up and teach. Like, stop bitching about how hard it is. I understand, right? And you of all people, as a race scholar, know how difficult of a burden it is for black and brown people, especially black women, to have to do the work of educating people. But unfortunately, if we don't do it, what has become of the internet machine is that, inflammatory, conspiracy theory, agitating headlines, right, are much more interesting and searchable and thereby profitable because of the way the internet is set up, than truth. Truth is fucking boring. Yeah. No one gives a shit about truth. It's not interesting. Yeah. Right? Why do you think there was that spree of headlines that people were so bought into where, like, can you believe that this happened to so-and-so? You'll never guess what happened to this thing. Your brain will explode when blah, blah, blah. And you're like, who the fuck is clicking this shit? Right? If you're rational, you're like, why would anybody ever open that? For what? Why do you need to know? You have no idea what's going to be in there. So what is drawing you in other than the headline that says like, oh, you will be illuminated to something?
Mm-hmm.
The left isn't doing that. The left isn't hyping up the fact that like you need to learn why shit is terrible, right? They're like, go look anywhere, and it should be very easy for you to find out why shit is terrible, right? If you open your eyes for a second, the assumption is that you'll see it, but that's not how the internet's set up. It's not how search engines work. It's not how social media works. It's not how YouTube works.
Right.
Everything is set up to give you only what they feel like you should be getting, right? And the stuff that is more interesting and exciting is usually the stuff that's really problematic.
Yeah.
We actually do really well, I think, as scholars to, and I don't know if you do this, but like, I follow a bunch of conservative media outlets on Twitter and shit. I need to know what they're saying.
Yeah, know thy enemy.
Like, I need to know what they're saying. I don't buy any of it because inevitably when I go in and look, as I am wont to do, I don't see any supportive evidence. I see a lot of skewed perceptions and things taken out of context, and I'm like, well, of course, none of this makes any sense. But most people aren't doing that work. And when you read an article or a news reporting from the other side of the debate, you don't see the same level of I don't know, like theatrics, I think might be the right word, right? Like I feel like when you look at lies and half truths that are reported online, it's like reading a fucking marquee. Mm-hmm. But when it's the facts, you're looking at like the little chalk sign outside of a coffee shop. And you're like, I might have looked at it once, but I don't really care what it says. Right? When like you're gonna remember the shit that was up in lights, and that's part of the problem. I feel like we've just gotten lazy about presenting the information. Just use the tools of the platform the way that they're being used. Like throw 17 ads in that bitch, right? Give it an inflammatory headline. I was just looking at our YouTube videos as a point of fact, and I was watching a video from Alpha Gaming about like YouTube content and how to get better viewership. Because I'm trying to get educated about this podcasting shit. The business side of it. And he's like, you got to use those catchy titles. And we've joked about like I kind of hate YouTube titles. I think they're annoying, right? Like every time I look at them, I'm just like, why is this like this, right? But then I looked at our videos, and you know what 3 videos have the best viewership? Like most of our videos have like 4 or 5 views on them. We have 3.
Is one of them the LGE video?
We have no, it's not. We have 3.
Okay.
We have 3 that are above 20 views each.
Okay. Tell me. Put me on.
They're the ones whose titles are questions. All it takes, and this was something said in the video that I was watching, is to pose a question.
Yeah.
That slightly alludes to what's going to happen.
Sure.
And people are like, wait, what? What is that? Right? Like, I'm like, nothing about the title makes any sense to anybody. But apparently, phrasing that inquiry is alluring to people. Aside from the one video that literally the first word in the title is nude, because we're talking about the nude photo leaks on the gram for Chris Evans, and that also has high viewership because the internet can't be trusted to not look at anything that doesn't maybe have to do with naked shit, right? Yeah. But it's funny that like that is really how our brains have been conditioned to operate with this medium. We are drawn to that inquisition a little bit. We want to know more. And so having people just like take the the moral high road and be like, why don't you go fucking do the legwork? It's like, no, you do the legwork. You're educated. Just take 5 minutes out of your day and do it.
So let me ask you this then, because as a 30-year-old, right? Like I'm a grown adult, and I'm an educator, right? I'm trained in sociology and in teaching. Yep. I see it as like a function of my job.
Same.
Like not only do I literally teach about issues of race and inequity more broadly, but that is my calling. That is my vocation. It is to teach. And so when I get a white kid who's like, and it's funny because I always see that look of like, am I even allowed to ask you a question? Mm-hmm. Right? Like, I think that's where we are in this like landscape of how we talk about race. I think my white kids feel like, am I allowed to have questions? Like, right? Do I get to have dissenting opinions? Right? Because so much of how we talk about race now is white folks are not allowed X, right? A lot of it is about what we're not supposed to do. And I'm like, no, 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 yes, I am your teacher. Like my job is to help, but not to do the work for you, but to light up lampposts along the way so that you might do the work. That's how I see my job, right? It's
Yeah.
not like I'm not spoon feeding like an infirm child. I'm saying, hey, you should check out the privileged poor. And let's you know what? I'll lend you my copy. Check it out, and in 2 weeks I'll order us pizza and we'll chat.
Yep.
Right? Like that to me feels really important. Here's a resource. I care about you as a student. I care about the questions you have. I'm but it's on you. It's on you. And I'm happy to be like the backboard of accountability, but you got to do the work.
Yeah. And I don't think
And
you're
that
wrong. I think that
you,
that's where the like the left and right, as polar opposites are different. I think that
yeah.
the right is saying like I have citations for you, right? Like here's a
Right,
Reddit
right,
thread.
right.
If you need help, come here. Like this is where the info is, and this is where people will tell you to find more info. Whereas
Right.
as to your point, and I don't think that's even far off. The left is just saying like just put in a Google search like what is racism and hope
Right.
that you're gonna get the answer.
So, but here's my question though, right? Like that works for me because that's my vocation.
Yep.
This
Big
someone
fish.
literally could to do this.
Yep.
Am I locked up? Am I frozen?
No, you're better now.
Okay. Yeah, my connection's been unstable. My bad. Um, so right, like I get paid to do this.
Yep.
And I hear so often in some of the progressive circles that I like increasingly have divorced myself from because progressive, that's what they think they are. But in any case, who'll say, well, anti-racism is white folks' work. Hold the fuck up. I'm not about to like. I'm not to say I'm not in a place where I'm going to say white folks need to now be responsible for my freedom.
Right.
The fuck kind of shit is that?
Yeah.
No way. And the other piece too is I think about like the white folks that like I love and that I do this work with. Like, there's so numerous colleagues. I've built really great rapport, right? And I love them. And part of it is like, I think they do good work because they're willing to ask me questions.
Mm.
When I point them in a direction, they're willing to check that out. And like we break bread over it. And I don't feel like they're asking me to do extra, right? Now, so that's and right, that's a piece there's about like that's my job to teach. The other piece is like I'm doing it with another adult and we're building something together, right, across racial lines. But I remember being an undergrad and invariably whenever anything about race, regardless of whether or not it involved Latinos or black folk, invariably there was that look like, where's Reese in the back? And that's when I started joking, like, my fault, guys. I missed the United Negro like consulate meeting this month. I didn't bring the meeting minutes. So what like the question that I have, and I'm being so circuitous and that's not helpful, is what would I can say that now at 30. My obligation is to teach. That's how I contribute to these movements. And I will keep teaching. And I will keep teaching my privileged students. But what do I say to my 20-year-old self who's like, I'm sick and fucking tired of everybody looking to the back, expecting me to like offer something illuminating for the edification of other people. Because that was, in my 20s, legitimately fucking exhausting.
Yeah.
So what do we say to that kid?
Oh God, that's a tough one because it is true that there's an undue burden placed onto students of color, non-white kids who are just like in the classroom and it's like, well, you're here, what do you think? Right? And you're just like, I'm reminded of the fact that whenever I teach race to my intro kids, I showed them the Key and Peele sketch of Black Republicans where the whole mantra of the skit is we're not a monolith. And I feel like that's the thing that needs to be explained to people. I think when you're a young non-white person who is being tasked by a group of sometimes well-meaning, sometimes just like stereotypically, acting individuals who are like, excuse me, non-white kid, can you tell me like what I need to know about this thing? I feel like the only response that any kid in that situation can give is like, I don't speak for everybody. I literally can't because we're not all the fucking same.
Yeah.
Like it is not my job to speak for everybody. And you're right that it differs heavily from when you become an academic and your job is to teach, because now you're saying like I don't speak for everybody still. However, I have information about different groups that I can now provide you with because I know it. I know this stuff, trained. Right? But I think there's a lot to be said about teaching younger kids to be like, yo, I do not speak for everybody of my group, of other groups of color. It is not possible for me to do it. I like, it's difficult enough navigating being yourself in those circles, right? To let alone be then tasked with speaking for everybody on behalf of all Latinos on campus, right? You're just like, well, maybe they don't agree with me. Maybe the Dominicans don't want to vibe with the Puerto Ricans. Maybe the Latin American students are like, how dare you think that we have anything to do with your bullshit, right? Like, you don't know, but you feel the pressure to do it anyway. So I don't know that I would have had a good answer back then, honestly. I feel like I would have just gotten mad and be like, the fuck is wrong with you? Like, you're not, you know,
I was in
you're like, I would have been like, you know, it would be like asking the one Muslim kid in your class, like, yo, so can you explain to us, like, why everything in the Middle East is terrible? It's like, it's not terrible. First of all, y'all fucked it up. But, like, I'm from one country in one area of the region, and I happen to be Muslim, right? They're, all those things do not necessarily equate each other, so I can't tell you exactly what you want to know, right? That's the best I can make sense of it. That's how it feels. I feel like when you get asked as a kid, and I feel like I've had similar experiences, especially in high school when I was like asked things about anybody that wasn't a white kid, because I lived with all the kids of color in my town, and they were like, so what about this? And I'm like, I don't fucking know. Like, I just don't know. Like, what do you want me to say? I don't know. It's confusing. Being an educator, I feel like it's slightly easier because I do like actually being the voice of reason in that regard. I like being the one that's like, I can give you resources. I can point you in the direction. I can help set up space to have these conversations, right? I posted a screen cap on my Gram story from this week, reading a student's journal, who was like, this class is illuminating shit for me in ways that I would not have had access to otherwise. I didn't have to take this class. This class is just to get my writing cred. And yet I'm learning things about my life and the way that I live and the society I live in that I would never have thought about otherwise. Right. And they're like, you know, I'm enjoying that there's space to talk about it. And that's like a luxury for being an academic, I feel like. It's like the one good thing about having that space is that we have the ability to be like, we can curate an experience that allows for the asking of questions, that allows for us to be a resource, where people in the everyday don't get to do that, right? Like, you are expected to be Wikipedia at every turn, which is super unfair.
Yeah. My approach to this question that also feels like profoundly unsettled for me too, right? Has been, I think, like I feel like, and I'm talking about race because that's what I teach. I teach classes about race. Has been to always challenge my white students to like problematize their own whiteness, to challenge my students of color to think about how they're complicit in the racism that other kids of color experience, but to also like with my kids of color, to also get them to realize that like experience is not knowledge. Experience is that about which we produce knowledge, and so challenging them so that they're able to not just speak truth to power, but to speak that truth with fucking fire, and do that work with conviction, so that if they find themselves tasked with the impossible of speaking to this call for like the monolith, that they can rebut that with conviction, but I don't always know that that's enough.
Yeah, I know, so, and I think that's an interesting point too, right? Like, because I feel like I've only ever really pulled that off when I got to teach a class that was literally like it was just a dead focus on gender and nothing else, like gender and sexuality. I just got to like really hone in for a semester,
right?
And I don't know if you remember when I was telling you about it, but like my class was 99.9% women. I had one cishet white male kid in my class. Everybody
Yeah.
else was a woman of color, a queer woman. And so basically, like the way that like the class had to go was that one male student was tasked with speaking on the behalf of all male students on campus. That's like it happened a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Like sometimes I feel like, well, fuck. Like, can I protect this one student from himself, and also from the rest of the class? Not because I felt like I was obligated to, but like there would be conversations where he would be asked to be like, well, why do you think all the dudes on the campus are like this? And he'd be like, oh, I have no fucking idea. And you know, I'd be like, well, that's unfair. Like, he can't possibly know. But then I'd have to, as you very astutely put it, also get my female students to say like, but do y'all all also realize how you make this worse for each other in a lot of ways that like society has conditioned you to think are normal? Which, you know, we read a lot of books that sort of helped illuminate that for them to be like, you know, misogyny and you know, homophobia and all sorts of things aren't just the products of men. Like, women engage in them very actively as well. There's a hierarchy amongst women, and they were like, fuck me, like I did not realize that we were all this terrible all the time, like to each other in ways that we don't think about, right? Like one of my students literally in class had a revelation. I was like, I need to stop calling my friends bitch all the time as like a term of endearment. And I was like, maybe that's not a good look. Maybe it doesn't help when, you know, a dude feels entitled to call you a bitch because he hears you doing it to your friends. And they're like, oh, shit. Yeah. And I'm like, yeah, you didn't think that it was a problem. I'm sure you thought it was fine, that y'all were all cool with it. You knew that you weren't being mean to each other. Mm-hmm. But now you're being tasked with being like, well, why is it okay for you to say it and I can't say it? It's like, motherfucker, because you're not one of us. That's not how this works. But not thinking critically about where that practice came from and why it's a problem. Mm-hmm. But that comes with the caveat of being in the classroom that not all kids have access to, right? Like, think about the fact that we get to teach this subject. And most kids don't even take classes in this subject of any flavor, right? You got to opt into this shit. So if you don't ever step into this arena, there's no opportunity to build that base up.
Yeah. And then I think to loop this back to like what started us here is like, we're talking about like how productive it can be in the crucible of a classroom where you can be direct and you can be focused and you can choose and mold how you challenge different, you know, subsections of your classroom. But the internet is fucking Dodge.
Yeah. Oh, God. It's the Wild West. It's Westworld.
Build that, much less. Yeah, right. Like it's so hard to build that, much less sustain it. And so I think I think young people on the internet, especially that like cohort of young people for whom the internet is like totally ubiquitous and social media is totally ubiquitous, I think that there is a legitimate desire for bonafide engagement. But the classroom does things that like a thread of comments on an Instagram post doesn't, that retweets doesn't. There's something affective about like the classroom encounter that just can't be replicated on a discussion board or on a forum board.
You know what I think part of it is too? And this ties a little bit into the second topic, which I don't think we're even going to get to tonight because we're already going pretty deep. But I think that people forget that the way that we construct space online is very similar to the way we construct space physically. We look for niches where there's like a level of homogeny that we're okay with. And in a classroom like ours, we get to like completely destroy that idea, right? Like you may come into it thinking that you're going to share a lot of personal aspects with people, and that, you know, as you said, the way I tell it to my kids is like, just because it happened to you doesn't make it true. Like, it's not a fact. You can't use it as data. You can right. And so kids, whenever you're looking for common ground, everyone does that. They look for people that speak to their experience, and the internet makes that way easier because you can really sort of like self-segregate in ways that like you would do in like the lunchroom physically back in the day.
Yeah.
A classroom like a, you know, Peace and Justice or a social class or whatever isn't going to let you do that because that's not the point of that space. That space is not about finding commonality in that way. It's about deconstructing that commonality and trying to figure out why it's a fucking problem in the first place. That's the only, like, we get to exert that level of control over taking the space apart and reshaping it differently that
Right.
forums, chat rooms, different pages are not set up for. They are meant to speak to one group of one particular audience every single time without fail. They have no interest in appealing to anybody else. They're totally okay with that, in fact. Right? Like, you can't say, I'm going to teach to only these kids in my classroom today. Y'all can go fuck off. You can't do that shit.
Yeah. Well, and I think that one of the dangers that that I'm seeing, and this isn't about like where I'm teaching at necessarily, like we're not there, but I'm seeing this in other spaces, is I think that there's this inclination towards affinity that I think has value, but I think is ultimately going to be unproductive. It has value in that, I mean, we've had this moment. We've had this moment as friends, as colleagues, and I think every single person of color has had that moment where some really white shit goes down, and you're just like, and then the white folks leave the room, and y'all are like, what?
Oh God, yes.
You know what I'm saying? Like, and that affinity space that emerges the moment that the white folk leave that moment or that encounter is valuable and important, and yet, politics can't work that way. Like, when I think about anti-racism is not white people's work, it's not POC work, it's everybody's work. It is our work. And so necessarily we're going to need to move across difference. And is there room for like, and not just room, I think, is there a necessity for like white caucus space and black caucus space, etc.? For sure. But ultimately, advancing, like pushing the battle lines, that's our work together. And I think that to your point, like building that on the internet it's not impossible, but it has all of these trappings that I think if we're not super cautious, we can totally fall into. Especially given, right, to nod back to the social dilemma, right? Given how easy it is for us to algorithmically be funneled into these fucking echo chambers that then don't challenge us to think across difference, but actually just feed us a steady diet of like self-affirmation.
God, this would be such a great place to transition to talking about virtual organizing, because it's exactly like what needs to be happening.
Yeah.
To counteract that like desire to just like go down the rabbit hole of things that are easy to find and are going to be problematic. That people are having important, engaged conversations in a space like playing fucking Among Us is so revolutionary. It's not funny, right? To know that is happening flies in the face of what we're used to, right? To be like, why would you ever think that that's a good spot to be trying to teach people about voting or equality or racism or whatever the fuck you're gonna talk about, right? Like, it could be the most minor shit, but to hear that it's happening and it's happening on a very large scale is nuts, right?
Yeah.
Is a huge push against the the profit margins of like capitalism as the underbelly of the internet, right? To be like, all I want to do is just give you whatever's going to get the most clicks. And this is like, well, you got to kind of find your way here, but you'll also find a space with people that you want to talk to in a like non-threatening environment where you may actually get wisdom imparted onto you that's going to be useful and meaningful, and you'll be allowed to engage in conversation without that threat, right? It's like a pseudo classroom because the stakes are so low. Everyone's like, we're playing a game, but a game that's not all consuming and allows for you to have that space to be like, we can also talk about these other things while we do this. We can have open, honest conversations because, I think one of the big appeals of it, and I don't want to get too into it because I think we should cut the episode soon, is just that like you're kind of just like being yourself because you can't, well, not being yourself, but like you're being like as emotionally invested in it as you can be, which allows for a lot of interpersonal communication because you're like trying to suss people out. You're trying to get into people's feelings and their heads, and you're like, what are you thinking? Did you murder somebody, in med bay? Did you turn off the lights? Did you lock the door? Right? And so, like, while you're trying to, like, understand the nitty-gritty of people's, like, psychic process, there's also apparently like all these other really important conversations happening on the top of that, which I think is really fascinating and so different from what I'm used to, from all the fucking toxicity and bullshit that I hear before I mute the fucking Call of Duty lobby, right? Like,
yeah, right.
I don't know.
Yeah, our capacities to like repurpose and like, yeah, I mean, to like repurpose digital spaces, I think is amazing. It's in some ways like boundless, right? Because the internet in so many ways is boundless. Like the potential is kind of limitless. And I think that folks are organizing politically in a space like Among Us. I think nods towards like where the internet is moving, in where the use of the internet is moving, at least within like American culture, and American like political life. But I think it's in some ways like it feels like the avant-garde of digital activism, right? That quickly, like, it's not going to be about posting and retweeting, but it's going to be about like taking over digital space, and thinking beyond like the textuality of the internet at the risk of getting like super 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 abstract. Empire goes, save virtual organizing for next week. I need to log off. Peace out, homie. And I think that as folks think about the internet beyond its ability to look like text and feel like text, and our insistence on treating it like just a hotbed of text, I think we're going to start to see like really provocative iterations of organizing within the internet.
Yeah, we're gonna have to save it because I want to talk about like, you know, AOC's tweet from today about doing a voting campaign on Among Us, and the fact that people watch the debates on Twitch, and the fact that like it is becoming not a, you know, that like text mediated thing that people understand, right? That it is so much more than what people have been able to wrap their heads around as like I'm consuming stories, tweets, news, email. Like there's so much other shit going on.
Yeah.
In ways that people are like interacting with each other about the world around them and issues that are happening that are just vastly different from what we have been told we use the space for, right? And I feel like, again, going back to like maybe the origins of the show from like episode 1, like being a gamer and seeing your space change so much is very interesting to me.
It's nutty
to have people, you know, and like we do this when we play Call of Duty, man. Like when you know, you get into the hardcore lobby, you see the dickhead with the Trump clan tag, and of course, even if he's on your team, you kill him twice. You have to.
Yeah.
Right? You're like, I get my 2 kills in before, you know, I start killing myself because I'm team killing, and then you're done. Right? Because inevitably, without fail, I have never been wrong. Since Call of Duty 4, I've never been wrong. If anything in your fucking name or clan tag has anything to do with racism or sexism or what have you, the bullshit spewing from your mouth inevitably follows. I've never been wrong. I've never been proven wrong by anybody.
Yeah.
And so like I'm used to just like to gaming space being exactly that. To being a space of just vitriol and nonsense being spewed forth from the mouths of idiots, right? Who have just been sipping the haterade, as it were, for so long that's all they know. They have talking points, just like anybody else would. But now we're seeing, you know, politicians, some terrible, some not, activists, artists, all sorts of people who are like coming into the space and changing the landscape with the intent of galvanizing activism and social change and increased education, you know, like a higher social consciousness, which I would never have guessed, you know, from the original Call of Duty lobbies and messages.
Call of Duty 4?
Like the messages and the nonsense that we're used to getting.
Can you imagine? Message to all friends and recent players: please check your voter registration status.
Bro, oh my god, I would have myself a fucking giggle. I would love to get that message. That would make my day. And I bet you someone's done it. I'm 99% sure that recently someone's done it.